Chapter 7. When the lights returned once more to the Flying Swan, a moment or two after the Holocaust in Norman's kitchenette, they exposed a frozen tableau of deceit and duplicity which was a sad indictment upon the state of our society. Neville stood poised behind the counter, Knobkerry at the ready to defend his optics against any straining hands. Pooley held O'Malley's glass above his own, a stupefied expression upon his guilty face. Two professional domino players each had their hands in the spares box. Old Pete's dog was standing, leg raised, to the piano, and a veritable rogues' gallery of similar deeds was exposed the entire length of the bar. Neville shook his head in disgust. "You miserable bunch," was all that he could say. The only patron who had not shifted his position during the unscheduled blackout was a green-haired youth who had been so engrossed in his war against the aliens that he'd been totally oblivious to the entire event. "Patoo, patoo, patoo, patoo," crackled the machine. "Patoo, patoo, bugger!" The lad restrained a petulant foot and slouched over to the bar counter. "Where's me drink gone, Nev?" he asked. The part-time barman shrugged. "Ask this mutinous crew," he suggested. Raffles Rathbone turned towards the assembled multitude, but they had by now returned to their previous occupations. Conversations hummed, darts whispered, and glasses rose and fell. All was as it had ever been. "Same again, then, is it?" "Why not? Got 16,000, personal high score, got me initials up there 3 times. "Oh, goody, goody," sneered Neville. "Are you going to only want the half a shandy? I shouldn't crack a bottle of Bollinger, should I?" "The half will be fine, thank you." Neville did the honours. The Swan settled down once more to its lunchtime normality, and such it would no doubt have enjoyed, had it not been for certain distant screams, which were borne upon the light spring breeze to announce the approach of a certain small and disconsolate postman. Camels on the allotment!" The cry reached the Swan shortly before Small Dave. O'Malley choked into his beer. "No more," he spluttered, crossing himself. Pooley shook his head. It was proving to be a most eventful day, and it was early yet. Neville reached once more for his knobkerry, and Raffles Rathbone stood before the video machine, oblivious to the world about him. Small Dave burst into the Swan, looking very much the worse for wear. He lurched up to the counter and ordered a large Scotch. Neville looked down at the distraught postman, and it must be said that the makings of a fine smirk began to form at the edges of his mouth. Turning away, he drew off a single for which he accepted double price. Small Dave tossed it back in one gulp, as Neville had calculated, and ordered another. Camels," he continued. Neville drew off a large one this time, as a crowd was beginning to gather. "So, Posty," he said, pushing the glass across the counter towards the postman's straining hand. "How goes the day for you, then?" Small Dave made pointing motions towards the general direction of the allotments. His lower lip quivered, and he danced about in a state of obvious and acute agitation. "No more postcards, then?" Neville asked. "Camels!" howled the midget. Neville turned to O'Malley, who had dragged himself up to the bar counter. "Do you think our postman is trying to tell us something, John?" he asked. "He is saying camels," said Jim Pooley helpfully. "Oh, that's what it is. Camels, eh?" "Camels!" "Aye, 'tis camels for certain," said O'Malley. "He has a lovely way with words," said Neville, suddenly feeling quite cheerful, "and a good eye for a picture postcard." "For God's sake, Camels, don't you understand?" Small Dave was growing increasingly purple, and his voice was reaching a dangerous champagne glass splitting kind of pitch. "Is he buying or selling, do you think?" "I hadn't thought to inquire." Neville squinted down at the postman, who was now down on all fours, beating at the carpet. "He is impersonating, I think." Old Pete hobbled up. He had experienced some luck recently over impersonating, and wasn't going to miss out on a good thing. "It's not the way of a camel," he said authoritatively. "It's more like a gerbil." Small Dave fainted, arms and legs spread flat out on the floor. "It's polar bear skin," said Old Pete, "and a very good one too." Small Dave was unceremoniously hauled up into a waiting chair. A small green bottle was grudgingly taken down from its haunt amongst the Spanish souvenirs behind the bar, uncorked and waggled beneath the midget's upturned nose. "Camels," went Small Dave, coming once more to what there were left of his senses. "I find this conversation has become a trifle dull of late," said Neville. I think it might pay to hear him out. Pooley thrust his way through the throng with a glass of water. The postman spied out his approach. "What's that for?" he snapped. "Gonna give me a blanket bath, are you?" Jim coughed politely. "You are feeling a little better then? I thought perhaps you might like to discuss whatever is troubling you." "I should enjoy another scotch to steady myself." The crowd departed as one man. They had seen all this kind of stuff many, many times before. The ruses and stratagems employed in the cause of the free drink were as numerous as they were varied. The cry of "Camels," although unique in itself, did not seem particularly meritorious. "But I saw them, I did, wailed Small Dave as he watched the patron's hurried departure. "I swear." He crossed himself above the heart. "See this wet, see this dry. Come back, fellas, come back." No one had noticed John O'Malley quietly slipping away. He had become a man sorely tried of late, what with vanishing councilmen and everything. The idea of camels upon the allotment was not one which appealed to him in the slightest. He could almost hear the clicking of tourist box brownies and the flip-flopping of their beach-sandaled feet as they trampled over the golf course. It didn't bear thinking about. If there were rogue camels wandering around the allotment, O'Malley determined that they should be removed as quickly as possible. John jogged down Moby Dick Terrace and up towards the allotment gates. Here he halted. All seemed quiet enough. A soft wind gently wrinkled the long grass at the boundary fence. A starling or two pecked away at somebody's recently sown seed, and a small grey cat stretched luxuriously upon the roof of Pooley's hut. Nothing unusual here, all peace and tranquillity. O'Malley took a few tentative steps forward. He passed the first concealed tea box and noticed with satisfaction that all was as it should be. He crept stealthily in and out between the shantytown of corrugated huts, sometimes springing up and squinting around, eyes shaded like some Indian tracker. Then a most obvious thought struck him. There were only 2 entrances to the allotment, and any camel would logically have to pass either in or out of these. Therefore any camel would be bound to leave some kind of spoor which could surely be followed. O'Malley dropped to his knees upon the path and sought camel prints. He then rose slowly to his feet and patted at the knees of his trousers. "What on earth am I doing?" he asked himself. "Seeking camel tracks upon a Brentford allotment," he answered. "Have I become bereft of my senses?" He thought it better not to answer that one. And even if I saw a camel track, how would I recognise it as one? This took a bit of thinking out, but it was eventually reasoned that a camel track would look like no other track O'Malley had yet seen upon the allotment, and thus be recognised. O'Malley shrugged and thrust his hands into his trouser pockets. He wandered slowly about, criss-crossing the pathway and keeping alert for anything untoward. He came very shortly upon the decimation of Small Dave's pride and joy. Half-munched cabbages lay strewn in every direction. Something had certainly been having its fill of the tasty veg. O'Malley stooped to examine a leaf and found to his wonder large and irregular tooth marks upon it. "So," said he, "old Posty was not talking through his regulation headgear. Something has been going on here." He scanned the ground, but could make out nothing besides very human-looking footprints covering the well-trodden pathway. Some of these led off towards the Butts estate entrance, but O'Malley felt disinclined to follow them. His eyes had just alighted upon something rather more interesting. Slightly in front of Soap Distance Padlock's shed, an image glowed faintly in the dirt. O'Malley strode over to it and peered down. He was certain the thing had not been there earlier. The Irishman dropped once more to his hands and knees. It had an almost metallic quality to it, as if it had been wrought into the dirt in copper. But as to exactly what it was, that was another matter. O'Malley drew a tentative finger across its surface, but the thing resisted his touch. He rose and raked his heel across it, but the image remained inviolate. John peered up into the sky. It wasn't being projected from above, was it? No, that was nonsense. But surely it had to come off. You couldn't print indelibly on earth. He scuffed at the ground with renewed vigour, raising a fine cloud of dust which slowly cleared to reveal the image glowing up once more, pristine and unscathed. O'Malley stooped again and pressed his eye near to the thing. What was it? Obviously a symbol of some sort, or an insignia. There was a vaguely familiar look to it, as if it was something he had half glimpsed upon some occasion, but never fully taken in. It had much of the rune about it also. So, said a voice suddenly, you are a secret Mohammedan, are you, O'Malley? The Irishman rose to confront a grinning Jim Pooley. Surely Mecca would be in the other direction. O'Malley dusted down his strides and gestured towards the gleaming symbol. Now what would you make of that, lad? He asked. Pooley gave the copper-coloured image a quick perusal. Something buried in the ground, he suggested. O'Malley shook his head, although the thought had never crossed his mind. Is it a benchmark, then? I've always wondered what those lads look like. Not a benchmark, Jim. It is then perhaps some protective amulet carelessly discarded by some wandering magician. Although it seemed almost a possibility, O'Malley gave that suggestion the old thumbs down. All right, I give up. What is it? There you have me, but I will show you an interesting thing. O'Malley picked up Pooley's spade, which was standing close at hand, raised it high above his head, and drove it edgeways on towards the copper symbol with a murderous force. There was a sharp metallic clang as the spade's head glanced against the image, cleared Pooley's terrified face by the merest of inches, and whistled up to land safely several plots away. I'm sorry, said John, examining the stump of spade handle, but you no doubt get my drift. You mean you cannot dig it out? O'Malley shook his head. Right then. Pooley spat on his palms and rubbed them briskly together. Before you start, said O'Malley, be advised by me that it cannot be either erased, defaced, or removed. Pooley, who had by now removed his jacket and was rolling up his sleeves, paused a moment and cocked his head on one side. It has a familiar look to it, he said. John nodded. I thought that myself. The thing strikes a chord somewhere along the line. Pooley, who needed only a small excuse to avoid physical labour, slipped his jacket back on. He took out a biro and the now official handbook of Allotment Golf. Best mark it out of bounds, said O'Malley. Pooley shook his head and handed him the book. You're good with your hands, John, he said. Make a sketch of it on the back. If such a symbol has ever existed, or even does so now, there's one man in Brentford who's bound to know what it is. Oh, yeah. O'Malley smiled broadly and took both book and biro. And the good man is, if I recall, never to be found within a decanter of 5-year-old Scotch very far from his elbow. Quite so, said Jim Pooley, and as we walk we will speak of many things, of sporting debts and broken spades. And cabbages and camels, said John O'Malley.